The Wasatch Mountains hold their secrets well. Beneath layers of stone and soil, lost dreams lie buried alongside broken bodies, some still breathing, not yet resigned to their fate. A single shaft of sunlight pierces the darkness of an abandoned mine, illuminating a woman's bloodied hands as they desperately claw at fallen rock. Her wedding band catches the light, a tiny golden star in a universe of shadow. Outside, boot heels crunch on gravel as men mount horses and ride away. Satisfied their problem has been solved. They are wrong. Justice in these mountains doesn't arrive on scheduled trains or wear polished badges. It comes like a storm, unexpected, elemental, inevitable. It speaks through the whispers of pines and the ancient knowledge of those who knew this land, before silver veins were more valuable than human ones. In this territory, powerful men have learned that bearing the truth is simple. They have yet to learn how fiercely it fights to be free. Darkness pressed against the abandoned mine shaft like a living thing, hungry and relentless. The only sounds were water dripping from rotting support beams and the labored breathing of a woman who refused to die. Ella Chen's fingers traced the crude splint she'd fashioned from a splintered support beam and strips of her petticoat. The leg was broken, she was certain, but it was the knife wound in her side that worried her most, a deep gash that wouldn't stop bleeding. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight that penetrated the collapsed entrance, illuminating her broken figure. Just yesterday, she had been the respected widow of Silver Ridge's most promising geologist. Today, she was just another body Victor Caldwell intended to bury. The cold seeped through her tattered dress, chilling her to the bone as she struggled to shift away from the growing puddle beneath her. Every movement sent daggers of pain through her left leg, where Caldwell's enforcer had connected with sickening force before throwing her into this forsaken hole. 3 days ago, Ella had been preparing to leave Silver Ridge forever. 3 days ago, she had discovered the ledger that proved the Caldwell Mining Company had murdered her husband, Michael, and made it look like a mining accident. 3 days ago, she had still believed she might find justice. Now justice seemed as distant as the stars hidden beyond the sliver of sky, visible through the collapsed mine entrance. Victor Caldwell had ensured she wouldn't live to testify against him, dragging her to this abandoned shaft in the foothills of the Wasatch Mountains, beating her until she could barely stand, then triggering a controlled collapse that sealed the entrance. "You've got a choice, Mrs. Chen," Caldwell had drawled, striking a match against the rough wall. "Quick death by bullet or slow death by starvation. I'm feeling generous today." Ella had spat blood at his boots. "You'll hang for this, Victor, just like you'll hang for Michael." His response had been a cold laugh as he dropped the still-burning match onto the dry timber at the mine's entrance. The ensuing explosion had shaken the mountain, bringing down enough rock and earth to block the shaft while leaving her alive inside temporarily. A rattlesnake's death, Caldwell's men called it. Quick enough to avoid trouble, slow enough to satisfy vengeance. Ella pressed her hand against the wound in her side, wincing as fresh pain blossomed beneath her fingers. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped. Without proper care, infection would claim her, before thirst or hunger had the chance. The irony wasn't lost on her. Michael had come west 5 years ago, with dreams of geological discovery. Instead, he'd found only fool's gold and an early grave. Ella had remained to seek justice, only to face the same fate in one of the very mines that had consumed her husband's ambitions. As the meager light began to fade with the setting sun, Ella fumbled with the small tin box she'd managed to keep hidden in her boot. It contained her most precious possessions, her wedding band, a daguerreotype of Michael, and the folded document that had sealed her fate. The witness statement she'd prepared for the territorial marshal, detailing Caldwell's crimes. The paper might never reach its intended recipient now, but holding it reminded Ella of her purpose. She hadn't fought this long to surrender now, not while breath remained in her body. The darkness intensified as twilight gave way to night. Cold air flowed down from the mountain above, bringing with it the distant howls of coyotes. Ella tucked her uninjured leg closer to her body, trying to conserve what little warmth remained. Her thoughts drifted to Michael, kind, ambitious Michael. With his dreams of building a life in the West, they had left San Francisco together 4 years ago, newly married and full of hope. The silver mines of Utah Territory had called to him like a siren song promising wealth and opportunity beyond anything possible on the crowded coast. Reality had proven harsher. The claims Michael purchased turned out to be nearly depleted. What little silver they did yield barely covered expenses. Then Victor Caldwell had arrived in Silveridge offering to buy Michael's claims for a fraction of their worth. When Michael refused, accidents began to happen. Equipment broke mysteriously. Support beams weakened overnight. Miners quit without explanation. Fear evident in their eyes. Through it all, Caldwell's offer remained open, the price dropping with each new setback. Ella had urged Michael to sell, to cut their losses and start fresh elsewhere. But Michael had discovered a new vein in the deepest shaft, rich enough to change everything. He had just one more inspection to complete before filing the official paperwork. He never returned from that inspection. The official report claimed a support beam had failed, trapping Michael beneath tons of rock. No body was ever recovered. Ella might have accepted the explanation of a tragic accident had she not overheard two of Caldwell's men drinking at the saloon, laughing about how easy it had been to arrange an accident for the Chinaman. Their words had ignited something in her, a burning need for justice that consumed her grief and left only cold determination in its place. For months she had gathered evidence, carefully documenting Caldwell's pattern of intimidation and violence. Other widows shared similar stories. Husbands who refused to sell their claims, mysterious accidents, properties acquired for pennies on the dollar by Caldwell's growing empire. When Ella finally had enough evidence, she had written to the territorial marshal, requesting an urgent meeting. The letter had been intercepted. Hours later, Caldwell's men had dragged her from her home in the Chinese Quarter and brought her to this abandoned mine to die slowly in the darkness. Another wave of pain radiated from her injured leg, pulling Ella back to her dire present. She had no food, no water, and no real hope of rescue. Silveridge was 5 miles away, and this particular mine had been abandoned for years. No one would think to look for her here. The rational part of her mind suggested surrender, close her eyes, let exhaustion claim her, and slip away to join Michael. It would be easier than fighting the inevitable. But something deeper refused to yield, the same stubborn streak that had carried her through months of widowhood in a frontier town hostile to a woman alone, especially one with Chinese heritage. The same determination that had driven her to seek justice when others counseled her to accept Michael's death and move on. Ella forced herself to assess her situation with brutal honesty. The mine entrance was blocked but not completely sealed. The shaft of sunlight that had illuminated her prison earlier proved that air could flow in and out. Perhaps with enough effort, she could widen the opening enough to escape. She dragged herself toward the collapsed entrance, each movement sending fresh agony through her broken leg and wounded side. Progress was measured in inches, with frequent stops to combat waves of dizziness. By the time she reached the rockfall, sweat drenched her clothing, despite the chill air. Moonlight now provided the only illumination, a pale silver beam that highlighted the enormity of her task. Boulders larger than a man blocked most of the entrance, interspersed with smaller rocks, timber, and earth. The small opening that allowed air and light wouldn't accommodate anything larger than a jackrabbit. Ella began anyway, pulling at smaller rocks with bloodied fingers, ignoring the pain as jagged edges tore her skin. Each stone removed was a tiny victory against Caldwell, against death itself. She worked until her arms trembled with exhaustion and her wounded side screamed for mercy. The resulting gap was disappointingly small, perhaps twice the size of the original opening, but nowhere near large enough for escape. Worse, each rock she removed caused ominous shifting in the larger boulders above. One wrong move could bring down the rest of the entrance, crushing her or sealing her tomb completely. Defeated for the moment, Ella retreated to her previous position. She needed water soon. The thirst that had begun as discomfort now clawed at her throat like a living thing. She studied the damp patches on the mine floor, where water dripped from above. Using the tin box that held her treasures, she positioned it to catch the infrequent drops. As the night deepened, temperatures plummeted further. Ella's thin dress offered little protection against the mountain chill. She began to shiver uncontrollably, her teeth chattering loud enough to echo in the confined space. If the cold didn't relent, she might not survive until morning. Ella tried to focus on survival. Michael had taught her basic techniques during their first mountain expedition. Layers Ellie, he'd insisted using his pet name for her, Layers trap heat better than one thick covering. Following the memory of his advice, she used her remaining strength to drag herself to the back of the shaft, where old mining equipment lay abandoned. A canvas tarp, stiff with age and dust, offered potential salvation. She pulled it over her body, creating a barrier against the worst of the cold. Under this meager shelter, Ella finally surrendered to exhaustion. Her last conscious thought was a promise to Michael, to herself, that she would not die forgotten in this mountain prison. Somehow she would survive to see Victor Caldwell face justice. Dreams came in fragments, memories distorted by pain and hunger. Michael laughing as they crossed the Sierra Nevada, full of excitement for their western adventure. His proud tour of his first mine claimed his eyes alight with dreams of silver veins and prosperity. Their small cabin in Silveridge humble, but made warm by shared purpose and affection. Then darker images. The sheriff at her door, hat in hand, unable to meet her eyes as he delivered news of the accident. Victor Caldwell's false sympathy as he offered to buy her husband's claims to ease your burden. The gradual realization that Michael's death had been deliberate, orchestrated by men who valued profit above human life. Ella woke to pain and the disorienting darkness of the mineshaft. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was or why her body felt shattered. Reality returned with cruel swiftness as she shifted in agony, lanced through her broken leg. The tin box had collected perhaps 2 tablespoons of water during the night. Ella consumed it with careful restraint, letting each precious drop linger on her parched tongue. It wasn't enough, nowhere near enough, but it rekindled her determination to survive. Morning light penetrated the small opening she'd created, illuminating her prison more clearly than before. The shaft extended perhaps 30 feet back into the mountain before ending in a pile of rubble from an earlier cave-in. Support beams, many rotting and splintered, lined the walls at irregular intervals. Tools lay scattered, and rusted picks. Shovels, the remains of an ore cart with one wheel missing. Ella's eyes narrowed as she studied the abandoned equipment. Perhaps weapons if properly utilized, or tools to widen her escape route. She began cataloging her assets and liabilities with methodical precision. Assets: the canvas tarp, rusty mining tools, the tin box for collecting water, the document proving Caldwell's crimes and her own stubborn refusal to die. Liabilities: a broken leg, a knife wound that showed early signs of infection, no food, minimal water, and a blocked escape route. The odds weren't favorable, but Ella had never placed much faith in odds. Michael used to tease her about her relentless practicality. "You don't hope for the best or fear the worst," he'd said once. "You simply determine what needs doing and do it." What needed doing now was finding more water and improving her shelter. The water dripping from the ceiling collected in tiny puddles before seeping into the ground. Using a flat piece of metal from the broken ore cart, Ella dug a small depression beneath the most consistent drip, lining it with a relatively clean corner of the canvas tarp. The improvised catch basin wouldn't provide much, but it improved her odds marginally. Next came the challenge of tending her wounds. The knife gash in her side had stopped bleeding, but felt hot to the touch, the beginning of infection. She had nothing to clean it with except the meager water she was collecting. Using a strip torn from her petticoat, she dabbed carefully at the wound, wincing as pain flared anew. The broken leg presented a more complex problem. Ella had set and splinted it as best she could, but the throbbing suggested the bone alignment wasn't ideal. Without proper medical attention, she might never walk normally, again assuming she survived long enough for that to matter. As the second day of her imprisonment progressed, hunger joined thirst and pain. As constant companions, Ella had last eaten breakfast 2 days ago, before Caldwell's men had dragged her from her home. The growing weakness in her limbs and the occasional dizziness that swept over her weren't encouraging signs. She forced herself to remain active despite the pain, knowing that surrendering to lethargy meant surrendering to death. Every hour she dragged herself around the perimeter of her prison, checking for any overlooked means of escape. She collected the precious few drops of water that accumulated in her makeshift basin. She experimented with using the rusted tools to dislodge smaller rocks from the blocked entrance. By late afternoon, exhaustion forced her to rest. Ella leaned against the mine wall, breathing heavily from even these minimal exertions. The infection in her side was worsening. Heat radiated from the wound, and angry red streaks had begun to spread outward. Without intervention, blood poisoning would claim her within days. As the light began to fade for the second time, Ella confronted her mortality with clear-eyed pragmatism. If rescue didn't come soon, she would die here. The realization brought neither panic nor despair, only a calm determination to leave something behind. Evidence of what had happened, proof of Caldwell's crimes. Using the last of her strength, she retrieved the witness statement from her tin box. On the reverse side of the document, using a piece of charcoal from the collapsed entrance, she began to write. Her handwriting, normally neat and precise, wavered with weakness, but the words remained legible. My name is Eleanor Chen, widow of Michael Chen. If you find this, know that I was murdered by Victor Caldwell and his men, just as they murdered my husband. The evidence of their crimes is detailed on the reverse of this page. I ask whoever finds this to deliver it to Territorial Marshal Thomas Robinson in Salt Lake City. Let justice be done, even if I am not alive to witness it. She signed her name with a flourish that consumed the last of her strength. Folding the paper carefully, she returned it to the tin box along with her wedding ring and Michael's daguerreotype. If her body was eventually discovered, perhaps these items would survive to tell her story. As darkness claimed the mineshaft once more, Ella closed her eyes. She had done all she could with what she had. Now fate would determine whether her story ended here or elsewhere. The sound came so faintly at first that Ella dismissed it as hallucination, the product of a fever-addled mind desperate for salvation, a scraping noise, rhythmic and deliberate, from the direction of the collapsed entrance. She held her breath, straining to hear, past the pounding of her own heartbeat. There it was again, unmistakable now, the sound of rock being moved with purpose. Hello, she called, her voice cracked and weak from thirst. Is someone there? The scraping paused momentarily, then resumed with increased vigor. Ella dragged herself toward the entrance, ignoring the protest of her injured body. I'm here, she called again, stronger this time. Please help. A shower of small rocks tumbled inward as the opening widened. Moonlight silhouetted a human figure working to enlarge the gap, broad-shouldered and determined. Caldwell. Ella whispered, fear suddenly overriding hope. Had he returned to confirm her death or finish what he'd started? The figure paused. No, came a deep voice, accented but clear. My name is James Hawks. I heard cries from within the mountain. Are you injured? Yes. Ella managed relief, making her lightheaded. My leg is broken. I can't climb out. Then I will come to you, the voice replied. Stand back from the opening. The opening in the mine entrance widened steadily as moonlight spilled across the dusty floor. Ella watched with a mixture of hope and trepidation as rocks shifted and tumbled inward. After what seemed like an eternity, the gap expanded enough to admit a human form. A man slipped through the opening with surprising grace for his size. In the pale moonlight, Ella could make out strong features, long black hair, secured with a leather band and clothing that blended traditional native garments with elements of European design. A rifle was slung across his back and a knife hung at his belt. James Hawks knelt beside her, his dark eyes assessing her injuries with clinical precision. The shaft is unstable, he said, his deep voice carrying a musical cadence. We must leave quickly. My leg, Ella explained, gesturing to her makeshift splint. I can't walk. He nodded once, unslinging a water skin from his shoulder and offering it to her. Drink not too fast. The water was cool and sweet against Ella's parched throat. She wanted to drain the skin in one desperate gulp, but forced herself to take small sips as instructed. Even this small amount of liquid seemed to revive her flagging strength. Hawks examined her splint without disturbing it, his expression revealing nothing. You have skill, he observed. The bone is aligned well. My father was a doctor in San Francisco. Ella explained, her voice stronger after the water. He taught me some basic medicine. The wound in your side concerns me more, Hawks said gently, lifting the blood-soaked fabric to examine the knife gash. There is infection. I know, Ella winced as his fingers probed the tender flesh around the wound. Will you help me reach Silveridge? There's a doctor there who... Silveridge is not safe for you. Hawks interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than argumentative. The men who did this, the ones who wear deputy badges but serve only greed, they search for you still. Ella's heart sank. Caldwell sent men to look for me. He can't possibly think I survived. He is a cautious predator. Hawks replied. He leaves nothing to chance. He gathered her tattered canvas shelter and examined the tin box she indicated. Is this important to you? Yes. Ella clutched the small container protectively. It contains proof of crimes, evidence that must reach the territorial marshal. Hawks secured the box inside his buckskin shirt without further questions. He then fashioned a more effective splint for her leg, using materials from his pack, his movements efficient and practiced. This will hold better during travel, he explained, but it will still cause pain. Pain I can handle, Ella assured him. It's death in this mine I was hoping to avoid. A ghost of a smile touched Hawk's lips. Then we are of one mind. He wrapped her in the canvas before lifting her with surprising gentleness. Hold to me, the path is not easy. The exit through the narrow opening was excruciating despite Hawk's care. Each movement sent fresh agony through Ella's broken leg and wounded side. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, determined not to cry out and potentially alert anyone who might be searching the area. Once outside, the cool night air felt like a blessing against her fever-heated skin. Ella drew deep breaths, savoring the scent of pine and sage after the stale, dusty confines of the mine. Stars carpeted the sky above their brilliance, unchallenged by any human lights in this remote location. Hawks settled her carefully on a blanket he spread for the purpose, then whistled softly. From the shadows among the pines emerged a magnificent paint horse, its coat gleaming silver and black in the moonlight. The animal approached without hesitation, nuzzling Hawk's shoulder in greeting. This is Spirit, Hawk said, stroking the horse's neck. He is strong enough to carry us both. Ella eyed the animal dubiously. I haven't ridden in years, and never with injuries like these. You will ride before me. Hawks explained, already preparing the horse. I will hold you secure. He worked swiftly, adjusting his saddle and attaching a bundle that contained supplies. We must reach my camp before dawn. It is not safe to travel these mountains in daylight while Caldwell's men search. The mention of Caldwell sent a chill through Ella that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly. You don't know me. This puts you at risk. Hawks paused in his preparations, his expression thoughtful. I know injustice when I see it, he said finally, and I know the man who hurt you. Victor Caldwell and his kind have brought much suffering to my people as well as yours. Before Ella could respond, Hawks lifted her onto Spirit's back with surprising ease, then mounted behind her. His arms formed a secure cradle as he reached around her for the reins, his body solid and warm at her back. Rest if you can, he advised as the horse began to pick its way down a barely visible trail. We have far to travel before sunrise. Ella intended to remain alert to memorize their route in case she needed to find her way back to civilization, but the rhythmic motion of the horse combined with exhaustion and the lingering effects of fever soon lulled her into a state of half-consciousness. She drifted between awareness and dreams, sometimes startling awake, when pain flared through her injuries, other times sliding into memories of happier days with Michael. Through it all, Hawks's presence remained constant, his arms steady around her, his occasional murmured directions to the horse in his native tongue, a comforting reminder that she was no longer alone in her fight for survival. When Ella next achieved full awareness, the quality of light had changed. Pre-dawn gray softened the landscape, revealing towering pines and rugged mountain slopes surrounding them. They had climbed higher rather than descending towards Silver Ridge, following game trails so faint only an experienced woodsman could navigate them. Where are we? She asked, her voice rough from disuse. Approaching my winter camp. Hawks replied, Few white men know these high valleys exist. We will be safe there while you heal. As if on cue, they crested a small rise, and the valley below came into view. Nestled among ancient pines stood a sturdy log cabin, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Behind it, a natural meadow provided grazing for several horses, and a swift-flowing stream bisected the clearing. "It's beautiful," Ella breathed, surprised by the permanent structure. She had expected a traditional teepee or temporary shelter. "My grandfather built it 40 summers ago." Hawks explained, guiding Spirit down the slope. "Before the mining companies came, before treaties were broken." The bitterness in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Ella remained silent, aware that her people, settlers, miners, railroad men, had brought tremendous change and often suffering to the native inhabitants of these mountains. As they approached the cabin, the door opened, and an elderly woman emerged. Her silver hair hung in two long braids, and her face was a map of experience etched in deep lines. She wore a practical blend of traditional Apache clothing and settler garments. A long deerskin skirt paired with a calico blouse adorned with intricate beadwork at the collar. "My grandmother, Sarah Whisperwind." Hawks said, respect evident in his voice. "She is a healer among our people." The old woman surveyed Ella with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She spoke rapidly to Hawks in their native language, her tone questioning. She asked what injuries you have sustained. Hawks translated after responding to his grandmother, and who caused them. "A broken leg knife wound to the side with infection beginning, and various other bruises." Ella replied, formally addressing the old woman directly despite the language barrier. "A man named Victor Caldwell and his gang attempted to murder me because I have evidence of their crimes." Tremashishur, Hawks translated, and Sarah nodded, her expression hardening at the mention of Caldwell's name. She gestured for them to enter the cabin, already turning to prepare something at the hearth. With careful movements, Hawks lifted Ella from the horse and carried her inside. The cabin's interior was surprisingly spacious and immaculately maintained. A large hearth dominated one wall with cooking implements hanging nearby. Simple but sturdy furniture, a table, chairs, storage chests occupied the main room. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with complex aromas. Sarah directed Hawks to place Ella on a bed pallet near the hearth, then immediately began examining her injuries with practiced hands. Though her touch was gentle, Ella couldn't suppress a gasp of pain when the old woman probed the infected knife wound. Sarah spoke again to Hawks, her tone urgent. "The infection must be drawn out immediately." Hawks translated, his expression grave. "She needs to prepare medicines. I must gather certain plants that grow near the stream." "Tell her thank you," Ella said, touched by the old woman's immediate willingness to help a stranger. "I'll do whatever she instructs." After translating, Hawks left to gather the required plants, while Sarah began heating water and grinding dried herbs with a stone mortar. She worked with the precision of decades of experience, occasionally humming what sounded like a prayer or healing song under her breath. While the old woman worked, Ella took the opportunity to examine her surroundings more carefully. The cabin walls held evidence of two worlds coexisting: traditional Apache crafts, alongside items clearly obtained from settler communities. A handcrafted bow hung beside a Winchester rifle. Baskets woven with intricate designs sat near iron cooking pots. Most surprising were the books, a small but diverse collection, stored carefully on a shelf protected from the elements. Ella could make out titles on medicine, botany, and several volumes of poetry. Nearby, a handwritten journal lay open beside a quill and inkwell. When she turned back, Ella found Sarah watching her with knowing eyes. The old woman gestured toward the books and said something that, even without translation, clearly conveyed pride. Hawks, Ella surmised, he reads English. Sarah nodded, then returned to her preparations. She combined the ground herbs with hot water to create a poultice, adding something from a small leather pouch that filled the cabin with a sharp medicinal scent. Hawks returned with fresh plants, water dripping from their roots. He presented them to his grandmother, who immediately incorporated them into her mixture. They spoke briefly, Hawks' expression growing concerned as Sarah gestured toward Ella's infected wound. "My grandmother must clean the wound thoroughly before applying her medicine," Hawks explained, returning to Ella's side. "It will cause significant pain. There is no avoiding this." Ella nodded, bracing herself. "I understand. Tell her to proceed." What followed was indeed agonizing: the thorough cleaning of the wound with hot water infused with pine resin, followed by the application of a poultice that seemed to burn and freeze simultaneously. Ella gripped the edges of the pallet until her knuckles turned white, refusing to scream, even as tears streamed unbidden down her cheeks. Throughout the ordeal, Sarah worked with single-minded focus, her weathered hands steady and sure. She murmured continuously in her native tongue. Whether instructions, prayers, or encouragement, Ella couldn't tell. When the wound was finally dressed with clean bandages made from soft beaten plant fibers, Sarah turned her attention to Ella's broken leg. She examined Hawks's splint with a critical eye, made a small adjustment, then prepared a different mixture of herbs, which she instructed Ella to drink, for pain and fever. Hawks translated, supporting Ella's head as she sipped the bitter liquid, and to help you sleep while the medicines work. The effect was remarkably swift. Within minutes, the sharp edges of pain began to dull, and a pleasant heaviness spread through Ella's limbs. Her eyelids drooped despite her efforts to remain alert. "Rest now," Hawks said, his deep voice seeming to come from increasingly far away. "You are safe here?" As consciousness faded, Ella's last coherent thought was that for the first time since Michael's death, those words might actually be true. Dreams came and went, like summer clouds, some dark and threatening, others bright with forgotten happiness. Ella saw Michael as he had been when they first met, laughing as he assisted her father in his San Francisco medical practice. She relived their journey east, full of hope and ambition, and the crushing disappointment as their dreams gradually crumbled under the harsh realities of frontier life. More disturbing were the nightmares. Victor Caldwell's cold eyes as he ordered his men to beat her, the suffocating darkness of the mine shaft closing in, the spreading infection that threatened to consume her from within. Throughout these dream fragments, another presence occasionally manifested, a woman with silver braids who sang in a language Ella didn't understand, but somehow found comforting. Sometimes a man appeared beside the singing woman, his steady hands applying medicines or adjusting blankets, before dissolving back into the dreamscape. When Ella finally woke fully, sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, suggesting late morning or early afternoon. The fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. The burning pain in her side had subsided to a dull ache, and someone had placed a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. Sarah sat nearby, grinding something in her mortar. She looked up immediately when Ella stirred her dark eyes, assessing water. Ella asked, her throat parched. The old woman nodded understanding and brought a wooden cup. She helped Ella sit up enough to drink, then examined the wound at her side, making sounds of approval at what she found. Ella gathered her courage and looked down at the injury herself. The angry red streaks that had indicated spreading infection were gone. The wound edges appeared clean and were already showing signs of healing. Whatever Sarah had applied had worked more effectively than any medicine Ella had seen her father use in San Francisco. "Thank you," she said, meeting the old woman's eyes directly. "You saved my life." Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, she clearly grasped their meaning. She patted Ella's hand gently, then returned to her work with the mortar. The cabin door opened, admitting Hawks with an armful of firewood. He paused when he saw Ella awake genuine pleasure, warming his normally reserved expression. "You returned to us," he said, setting the wood beside the hearth. "Good. My grandmother was concerned the fever had taken too strong a hold." "How long have I been here?" Ella asked suddenly, realizing she had completely lost track of time. 3 days, Hawks replied, accepting a cup of tea from Sarah. "The infection was severe. Without my grandmother's knowledge, it would have claimed your life." Ella processed this information with shock. 3 days lost to fever dreams while her body fought the infection. 3 days during which Caldwell might have consolidated his power in Silveridge or destroyed evidence of his crimes. "I need to reach the territorial marshal," she said, attempting to sit up further before pain forced her back down. "The document in my tin box will wait until you are stronger," Hawks interrupted firmly. "The marshal's office is 4 days' ride from here, and you cannot yet stand, let alone travel." The frustration must have shown on Ella's face because Hawks' expression softened slightly. "I understand your urgency," he said, "but consider if you die attempting to deliver your evidence, Caldwell wins completely." The logic was irrefutable, if unwelcome. Ella subsided against the pallet, acknowledging the wisdom in his words with a reluctant nod. "Tell me about him," she requested instead. "How do you know Victor Caldwell?" Hawks's face grew still, the way deep water goes motionless before a storm. He exchanged a glance with his grandmother, who nodded once before leaving the cabin, presumably to give them privacy. 3 years ago, Caldwell came to our winter settlement with government men. Hawks began, his voice carefully controlled. They carried papers saying the land belonged to the mining company, now land our people had inhabited for countless generations. He stared into the fire, memories darkening his eyes. Our head man, Chief Running Bear, showed them our own papers, the treaty signed by the territorial governor guaranteeing our rights to these mountains. Caldwell laughed and burned the treaty before our eyes. Ella felt a chill despite the cabin's warmth. What happened? What always happens when my people stand in the way of gold or silver? Hawks replied bitterly, "Those who resisted were killed. Those who surrendered were forced to the reservation near the alkaline flats where nothing grows. My grandmother and I escaped to these high valleys where the mining companies haven't yet discovered wealth worth stealing." The story was tragically familiar. Ella had heard similar accounts throughout the Western Territories. Native peoples displaced by mining interests, broken treaties, communities destroyed. "I'm sorry," she said, the words wholly inadequate, but sincerely meant. Hawks acknowledged her sympathy with a slight inclination of his head. "Your husband," he said, changing the subject, "he was a miner, a geologist." Ella corrected. "Michael came west believing he could make his fortune in silver. He wasn't like Caldwell, though. He purchased his claims, legally paid his workers fair wages, treated the land with respect. And yet he is dead." He refused to sell to Caldwell when it became clear his main claim held a rich vein. Hawks observed, not unkindly. "Caldwell arranged an accident in the deepest shaft." Ella explained, the familiar grief tightening her throat. "No body was ever recovered." Hawks remained silent for a moment, respecting her pain. Then he asked, "The evidence you carry, it proves Caldwell's responsibility for your husband's death?" "That and more," Ella confirmed. "Financial records showing bribes to local officials, witness statements about intimidation tactics, a pattern of suspicious accidents befalling anyone who opposed his expansion plans." She met Hawks' gaze directly, enough to hang him if it reaches the right hands. Understanding passed between them, a shared determination to see justice done, to hold accountable a man who had inflicted suffering on both their worlds. "Then we will ensure it reaches those hands," Hawks said simply. "When you are strong enough to travel safely." Before Ella could respond, the cabin door burst open. Sarah entered, rapidly speaking to Hawks in urgent tones while gesturing toward the valley entrance. Hawks was on his feet, instantly reaching for the rifle that hung by the door. "Riders coming," he translated for Ella, 6 men heavily armed. Ella's heart seemed to stop. "Caldwell's men, they found us." Hawks moved with practiced efficiency, checking his rifle, while issuing rapid instructions to Sarah in their native tongue. The old woman immediately began gathering essential supplies into a small pack, while keeping low and away from the cabin's single window. "Can you move?" Hawks asked Ella, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. Ella pushed herself up on her elbows, fighting a wave of dizziness. "Not well, and certainly not quickly," she admitted. "Leave me. Take the evidence to the marshal. That's what matters." Hawks' expression hardened. "I do not abandon those under my protection," he said firmly, "and my grandmother would never forgive such dishonor." He crossed to the hearth and pulled up a section of floorboard Ella hadn't noticed before, revealing a narrow space beneath. "This cabin was built during a time when my people often needed to hide from soldiers," he explained. "There is a small chamber below that connects to a tunnel leading to the hillside behind us." Sarah appeared at his side, offering Ella a small vial of dark liquid. "For strength," Hawks translated. "It will help you endure what comes next, but the pain will return twofold afterward." Without hesitation, Ella drained the bitter concoction. Almost immediately, a strange warmth spread through her limbs, dulling the pain of her injuries and bringing heightened clarity to her senses. "Help me," she said, extending her arms together. Hawks and Sarah lowered her into the hidden space. It was cramped but not coffin-tight, extending perhaps 8 feet in length and wide enough for a person to lie flat. A faint draft suggested the tunnel Hawks had mentioned. "My grandmother will guide you through the tunnel," Hawks said, handing down Ella's tin box of evidence. "It emerges near the stream where the rocks will hide your tracks. Follow the water upstream to the second waterfall, then east through the pine forest. There is a cave there where our people have sheltered for generations." "What about you?" Ella asked suddenly, fearful for his safety. "I will lead them away from here," he replied, checking his ammunition. "Make them believe we fled north toward the reservation." "They'll kill you if they catch you," Ella protested. A grim smile crossed Hawk's face. "They must catch me first. These are my mountains. I have hunted them since childhood." Sarah spoke sharply, clearly, disagreeing with the plan. Hawks responded with quiet authority, and after a brief argument, the old woman subsided, though her displeasure remained evident. "What did she say?" Ella asked. "That I am stubborn, like my father." Hawks replied, the hint of a smile softening his features momentarily. "And that if I get myself killed, she will be very disappointed." Before Ella could respond, hoofbeats sounded in the clearing outside, much closer. Now Hawks quickly replaced the floorboard concealing the hiding space. The last thing Ella saw before darkness enveloped her was Hawks placing a finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence, then moving toward the door, rifle in hand. Sarah touched Ella's arm, guiding her attention to the narrow tunnel that extended from the hiding space. It was barely wider than Ella's shoulders, its earthen walls supported by timber beams at regular intervals. In her current state, with the mysterious medicine temporarily masking her pain, Ella believed she could navigate it, though crawling would be necessary. Above them, the floorboards creaked as Hawks moved around the cabin. A moment later, the sound of the door opening was followed by the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. "That's far enough," Hawks's voice carried clearly through the floorboards. "State your business." "Looking for a woman," replied a harsh voice. Ella instantly recognized as belonging to Sheriff Wallace Caldwell's most ruthless enforcer. "White woman injured, might have passed through here. No women here except my grandmother." Hawks replied evenly, "And she has seen no one." "Mind if we take a look inside?" Wallace didn't phrase it as a question, and the sound of multiple boots on the cabin's porch emphasized the implied threat. "My grandmother is unwell," Hawks said, his tone hardening. "Our customs forbid strangers entering our dwelling during healing rituals." A different voice spoke up, younger, with the drawl of Texas or perhaps Arkansas. "He's lying Injuns always hide white women they kidnap. Shuck 'em." "Nobody's been kidnapped, Jenkins," Wallace responded irritably. "The woman escaped from a mine collapse, probably delirious, wandering the mountains. Mr. Caldwell's concerned for her safety." The blatant lie made Ella's blood boil. Beside her in the cramped space, Sarah seemed to sense her reaction and placed a restraining hand on her arm, squeezing gently in warning. "I've trapped these mountains for 20 years, Hawks said above them. "I would have noticed a woman wandering alone. The only tracks I've seen this week have been deer, elk, and yesterday a mountain lion near the eastern ridge." "See Jenkins," Wallace said eagerly. "He admits he was near the eastern ridge. That's where the mine is. I trapped the entire range." Hawks replied, a note of controlled exasperation entering his voice. "As I have since before you were born, boy." A tense silence followed, broken by the sound of horses shifting nervously in the clearing. "We'll still need to search the cabin," Wallace stated flatly. "Orders from Mr. Caldwell himself. Then Mr. Caldwell can come present those orders in person." Hawks countered, along with papers showing his authority over Apache dwellings in unceded territory. The standoff was palpable, even from Ella's hidden position. She could picture Hawks blocking the doorway, rifle ready, but not yet aimed directly at the intruders, a delicate balance between deterrence and provocation. "Listen, Injun," Jenkins began, but Wallace cut him off. "That's enough," the older man said sharply. "We're wasting time." His voice shifted, addressing Hawks again. "You're sure you haven't seen a white woman, Chinese-looking, black hair, probably wearing a blue dress, badly injured? Mr. Caldwell's offering a substantial reward." I have not, Hawks stated, but if I encounter anyone matching that description, I will bring word to Silveridge. Another tense silence fell, broken only by the soft nickering of horses and the distant call of a hawk circling above the meadow. Mount up. Wallace finally ordered, "We'll check the northern passes." Boots shuffled on the porch, followed by the sounds of men returning to their horses. "Remember, Apache," Wallace added, "substantial reward. More money than you'd see in a year of trapping." "I will remember," Hawks replied neutrally. Hoofbeats receded as the search party departed, though Ella held her breath until the sounds had faded completely. Above her, the floorboards creaked as Hawks moved around the cabin, presumably checking that the men had truly left. Several minutes passed before the hidden panel lifted, revealing Hawks' face taut with concern. "They've gone," he confirmed. "But they'll return with more men once they've searched the northern valleys and found nothing. We need to move immediately." "The original plan remains best." Ella agreed, the temporary strength from Sarah's medicine already beginning to fade around the edges. "Your grandmother will guide me through the tunnel while you create a false trail." Hawks reached down to help Ella from the hiding place, his strong hands gentle but urgent. Once she was seated at the cabin's small table, Hawks and Sarah conferred rapidly in their language, occasionally gesturing toward the mountains, visible through the window. Ella couldn't follow their words, but their body language suggested disagreement. Finally, Sarah turned to Ella and spoke at length, her weathered hands emphasizing certain points. Though the words were unintelligible, her intent seemed clear. She was issuing instructions. "My grandmother says you must remain in the cave for 3 days." Hawks translated when the old woman finished. "She has prepared medicines you must take morning and night for the infection, and a poultice that needs changing daily." He indicated the small pack Sarah had assembled. "There is food, water, and all necessary supplies within 3 days." Ella repeated, anxiety rising. Caldwell could destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, even flee the territory in that time. "Or he could find and kill you, ensuring no one ever knows his crimes." Hawks countered, 3 days will allow your body to heal enough for the longer journey to the marshal's office." His expression softened slightly. "My grandmother rarely makes suggestions. When she issues commands, even the mountain lions listen." Despite the gravity of the situation, Ella felt a smile tug at her lips. "She reminds me of my aunt in San Francisco. Once she made up her mind, even the Pacific Ocean wouldn't change her course." Sarah, watching their exchange, seemed to sense the comparison was favorable, and nodded approvingly before returning to her preparations. Hawks checked his rifle once more and secured additional ammunition in his belt pouch. "I will lead the search party on a long journey." He explained, far enough that they will not return quickly, but not so obvious that they suspect deception. "Be careful," Ella urged. "Wallace has a reputation for cruelty, especially toward native people. He's killed men for far less than interfering with Caldwell's plans." Hawks acknowledged her warning with a slight nod. "I know these men. I have observed them many seasons, learning their habits as I would study any dangerous predator. They are formidable in town with numbers and whiskey to strengthen them. In the mountains alone, they are simply men, and not particularly skilled ones at that." His quiet confidence was reassuring. Ella had seen how Hawks moved through the forest like a natural extension of the landscape, rather than an intruder. If anyone could outwit Caldwell's men in these mountains, it would be him. Sarah approached with a small wooden cup containing another dose of her medicinal brew. She spoke briefly, her tone brooking no argument. "For the tunnel," Hawks translated, "the medicine's strength will fade quickly once you begin moving, but it should last long enough to reach the cave." Ella accepted the cup gratefully, drinking the bitter mixture without hesitation. As before, warmth spread through her limbs, temporarily masking the pain of her injuries. "Thank you," she said to Sarah, meeting the old woman's penetrating gaze directly, "for everything." Sarah clasped Ella's hand briefly between her weathered palms, speaking a few words that needed no translation, a blessing, a wish for protection, universal in its intent. Hawks moved to the door, checking the clearing one final time before turning back. "I will find you at the cave in 3 days." He promised, "Rest, heal, trust my grandmother's wisdom." With those parting words, he slipped outside, a shadow melting into the forest, At the edge of the clearing, Sarah wasted no time on sentiment. As soon as Hawks departed, she helped Ella back to the hidden entrance in the floor, passing down the small pack of supplies, before assisting Ella herself. The tunnel seemed narrower than before, its earthen walls pressing close on either side. Ella forced herself to breathe slowly, fighting the instinctive panic of enclosed spaces. Sarah entered behind her, pulling the floorboard back into place and securing it somehow from below. Complete darkness enveloped them until Sarah produced a small tallow candle, its feeble light barely illuminating a few feet ahead. Sarah made a soft sound, encouraging Ella to move forward. Progress was painfully slow. Despite Sarah's medicine dulling the worst of her pain, Ella's broken leg made conventional crawling impossible. She developed an awkward method of pulling herself forward with her arms, while dragging the injured limb behind her, trying to protect it from further damage. The tunnel sloped gently downward, occasionally turning to follow the natural contours of the land. Support beams appeared at regular intervals, testament to the careful engineering that had created this escape route. Ella wondered how many times it had been used over the years, how many lives it had saved during conflicts between Apache people and encroaching settlers. After what seemed an eternity but was likely less than half an hour, Ella detected a change in the air, fresher, carrying hints of pine and water. Ahead, a faint grayish light suggested the tunnel's exit. Sarah made an encouraging sound behind her, urging her to continue. With renewed determination, Ella pulled herself the final distance, emerging into a small hollow, concealed by a natural formation of rocks and dense undergrowth. The stream Hawks had mentioned burbled nearby, its clear waters sparkling in the afternoon sun. Mountains rose on all sides, their slopes thick with pine forests, interrupted occasionally by meadows vibrant with late summer wildflowers. Sarah emerged from the tunnel, immediately offering Ella water from a skin she carried. After both had drunk, the old woman pointed upstream, where Ella could just make out the misty veil of a distant waterfall. Second waterfall, then east through the pines, Ella recalled aloud. How far is it? Sarah couldn't understand the words but seemed to grasp their meaning. She pointed to the sun, then made a gesture suggesting its movement across a quarter of the sky, perhaps an hour's journey for someone uninjured. For Ella, with her broken leg and still healing side, it would take considerably longer. Already she could feel Sarah's medicine beginning to fade pain, reasserting itself with growing insistence. The old woman seemed to sense this. She helped Ella to a sitting position against a boulder, then examined the splint on her leg, making small adjustments. From a pouch at her waist, she produced a carved walking stick of surprising lightness, offering it to Ella with a demonstrative gesture. With Sarah's assistance, Ella managed to stand leaning heavily on the walking stick. Pain shot through her leg, but the splint held firm, and she found she could manage a limping hop when necessary. It wasn't graceful, but it was movement. Their journey followed the stream as it wound through the valley. Sarah set a deliberate pace slow enough to accommodate Ella's injuries, but steady enough to cover ground. The old woman moved with remarkable agility, despite her age, occasionally pausing to point out particularly treacherous footing or to help Ella navigate difficult terrain. They passed the first waterfall, a modest cascade tumbling about 15 feet into a clear pool, and continued upstream. The valley narrowed its walls, growing steeper as they proceeded. Pine trees crowded close to the water's edge, their fallen needles creating a soft carpet underfoot that eased Ella's painful progress somewhat. By the time they reached the second waterfall, a more impressive cataract thundering down a 50-foot cliff face, the sun had moved noticeably westward, and Ella's strength was flagging badly. The medicine had worn off, entirely leaving her in escalating pain with each step. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the mountain chill, and her breathing had grown labored. Sarah studied her with concern, then pointed to a barely visible game trail leading east away from the stream. She mimed drinking, then eating, suggesting they would rest soon. The trail climbed gradually through dense forest, eventually opening onto a small meadow, dotted with late-blooming wildflowers. On its far side, a rocky outcropping rose perhaps 30 feet, its face split by a dark opening, partially concealed by stunted pines. The cave. They had arrived at their destination, just as Ella's remaining strength was about to give out entirely. Sarah helped her to the cave entrance, which proved larger than it had appeared from a distance. The opening was easily 7 feet high, and wide enough for two people to enter, side by side. Inside, the space opened further into a roughly circular chamber, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with a smaller adjoining space visible through an archway of natural stone. The cave showed signs of long use as a shelter. A stone-ringed fire pit occupied the center of the main chamber, with a natural chimney in the ceiling above it to vent smoke. Dried herbs hung from small niches in the walls, and a pallet of pine boughs covered with animal hides provided a surprisingly comfortable-looking bed. Most surprising was the small cache of supplies stored carefully along one wall, containers of water-dried food, extra blankets, even a small collection of tools and weapons. This was clearly a well-established refuge maintained regularly in case of need. Sarah helped Ella to the pallet, then immediately set about preparing a small fire in the pit. Soon, a cheerful blaze dispelled the cave's chill and illuminated its furthest corners. The old woman prepared a tea from her supplies, then examined Ella's wounds once more. The knife gash in her side was healing well, showing no further signs of infection. The broken leg remained properly aligned in its splint, though the surrounding flesh was badly bruised and swollen. After brewing another medicinal concoction, different from the one that had given Ella temporary strength for their journey, Sarah motioned for her to drink. This liquid was less bitter, with hints of mint and something vaguely reminiscent of licorice. Almost immediately, the worst edges of Ella's pain began to recede, replaced by a gentle warmth that spread through her limbs. "Thank you." Ella said the simple words wholly inadequate to express her gratitude. Though Sarah couldn't understand the language, she clearly comprehended the sentiment. She patted Ella's hand, then busied herself preparing a simple meal from their supplies: dried meat, some kind of grain cake, and berries that must have been gathered recently. As they ate, Ella found herself studying the old woman more carefully. Despite her evident age, Sarah moved with surprising grace and energy. Her hands, though gnarled with arthritis, remained deft and precise in their movements. Most striking were her eyes, dark, intelligent, and often twinkling with humor, despite the gravity of their situation. After the meal, Sarah helped Ella settle more comfortably on the pallet, adjusting the furs to ward off the mountain chill that persisted even with the fire. She checked Ella's splint one final time, nodding with satisfaction, then moved to make her own sleeping place closer to the cave entrance. Ella realized with sudden clarity that the old woman intended to stand guard while she slept, a touching but concerning notion given the dangers they faced. "You should rest too," Ella said, miming sleep. "I'll be fine." Sarah shook her head firmly, pointing to her eyes, then gesturing toward the cave entrance. Her meaning was clear. She would watch while Ella recovered her strength. Too exhausted to argue further, Ella allowed her eyes to close. Despite the extraordinary circumstances and the lingering pain of her injuries, sleep claimed her, almost immediately, deep and dreamless under the protective gaze of her unlikely guardian. When Ella next woke, sunlight angled through the cave entrance, suggesting mid-morning of the following day. She had slept nearly 12 hours, her body desperately claiming the rest it needed to heal. Sarah was already awake, tending a small fire over which some kind of porridge simmered in a battered pot. The old woman smiled when she noticed Ella stirring, immediately bringing her water and another dose of the medicinal tea. The day passed in a strange blend of anxiety and tranquility. Sarah tended Ella's wounds, changing the poultice on her side and examining the broken leg with careful fingers. She helped Ella perform necessary movements to prevent stiffness without further injuring herself, then encouraged her to rest again. Ella examined her tin box of evidence, ensuring the documents remained undamaged despite their journey. The witness statements, financial records, and her own detailed account of Caldwell's crimes represented her only hope of justice and potentially her death warrant if they fell into the wrong hands. By the second day in the cave, Ella had developed a rudimentary means of communication with Sarah, despite their language barrier. Simple gestures, facial expressions, and occasional drawings in the dirt floor allowed them to convey basic needs and information. Through this improvised language, Ella learned that Sarah had been a respected healer among her people for over 40 years, that she had taught Hawks the skills of medicine and tracking since his childhood, and that she considered the mountains themselves as living entities deserving of respect rather than mere resources to be exploited. In turn, Ella shared something of her own story, her journey west with Michael, their struggles and brief joys, and her determination to bring Caldwell to justice. Whether Sarah understood the specifics was unclear, but she seemed to grasp the emotional truth behind Ella's gestures and expressions. As the third day dawned, tension returned in full force. Hawks should return today assuming all had gone according to plan. If he failed to appear, difficult decisions would need to be made about their next steps. Sarah seemed equally concerned, making frequent trips to the cave entrance to scan the surrounding forest. Her normally calm demeanor had acquired an edge of anxiety that did nothing to soothe Ella's growing unease. Midday came and went with no sign of Hawks. Ella found herself listening intently for any sound that might indicate his approach, while simultaneously fearing the noise might represent Caldwell's men instead. Late afternoon brought gathering clouds and a sharp drop in temperature that suggested an approaching storm. Sarah added wood to their fire and secured the cave entrance with a cleverly designed barrier of branches that would keep out wind and rain while still allowing them to monitor the approach path. As twilight deepened toward night, Ella began to fear the worst. Had Hawks been captured? In Injur, Dutchki Isorantes. The possibilities tormented her as she watched Sarah's increasing distress, just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall outside. A low whistle sounded from the forest edge, 3 notes rising, then 2 falling. Sarah's face transformed with relief. She responded with a similar pattern, then hurried to remove the branch barrier. Moments later, Hawks appeared in the cave entrance water, already streaming from his buckskin clothing. But he wasn't alone. Behind him loomed another figure, taller and broader, wearing the unmistakable badge of a federal marshal. Ella stared in disbelief at the uniformed man who ducked into the cave behind Hawks. He stood well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a weathered face, partially obscured by a neatly trimmed beard threaded with gray. The silver star pinned to his rain-soaked coat confirmed her initial impression. A U.S. Marshal had somehow found his way to their hidden sanctuary. "Mrs. Chen," the Marshal said, removing his hat and nodding respectfully. "Marshal Thomas Robinson. I understand you have evidence regarding Victor Caldwell and the Silveridge mine incidents." Ella glanced at Hawks, who was accepting a blanket from his grandmother to dry himself. "How did you—" "I found the Marshal's camp just beyond Cougar Ridge," Hawks explained, rubbing his hair with the blanket. "He was already tracking Caldwell's operations before we ever met." Sarah spoke rapidly in her native tongue, her tone questioning. Hawks replied, explaining something that made the old woman nod with satisfaction before she busied herself preparing hot drinks for the newcomers. Marshal Robinson settled his considerable frame onto a stone near the fire, extending his hands toward the warmth. "I've been investigating Caldwell for almost a year," he said, accepting a steaming cup from Sarah with a grateful nod. "Started after 3 miners were found dead near Bitterroot, supposedly killed by Indians, except the Blackfoot people in that region recognized the work of Caldwell's men." "You believe Caldwell was responsible?" Ella asked. "I know he was," Robinson replied grimly. "But proving it has been another matter entirely. The man's careful uses, intermediaries, pays in untraceable gold dust ensures there are never reliable witnesses." He studied Ella with keen interest. "Until now, perhaps." Ella reached for her tin box, wincing as the movement pulled at her healing side. "I have documented evidence of Caldwell's operations in Silveridge," she said, extracting the carefully preserved papers, financial records showing bribes to local officials, witness statements about intimidation tactics, and evidence linking him directly to my husband's murder. Robinson accepted the documents, examining them with methodical thoroughness, while the others watched in silence. His expression remained neutral, but Ella noted the tightening around his eyes as he progressed through particularly damning sections. "This is precisely what I've been seeking," he said, finally carefully returning the papers to their container. "Names, dates, specific transactions, enough to bring formal charges before a federal judge." He looked up, meeting Ella's gaze directly. "I'm sorry about your husband, Mrs. Chen, and what you've endured since—" "Will it be enough?" Ella asked, the question that had haunted her for months finally spoken aloud. "Caldwell has influence connections in Sacramento and even Washington." "It's enough," Robinson assured her, "especially combined with evidence I've gathered from other territories. Caldwell is not just a local problem. He's been running similar operations across the western mining regions for years." His expression hardened. "The federal government takes a dim view of men who murder citizens and displace native populations for personal gain, particularly when they cover their crimes by inciting conflict between settlers and tribes. Hawks, who had been listening silently by the cave entrance, spoke up. My people have suffered greatly because of men like Caldwell. Each time violence occurs, they blame us, even when we are the victims. Robinson nodded grimly. I've seen it too often. A perfect strategy: steal land, blame the original inhabitants when they resist, then use that resistance to justify further seizures and violence. He turned back to Ella. Your evidence helps establish a pattern that goes beyond simple claim jumping or intimidation. It shows systematic corruption and manipulation of legal mechanisms. What happens now? Ella asked, a mixture of hope and anxiety churning in her stomach. After months of gathering evidence of surviving Caldwell's attempt to silence her permanently, the prospect of actual justice seemed almost too much to believe. First, we get you to safety, Robinson replied pragmatically. Silveridge isn't secure. Caldwell has too many men on his payroll there. I have a camp 3 ridges over with horses and supplies. Once this storm passes, we'll head for the territorial capital, where I have trusted colleagues waiting. He glanced outside at the increasing downpour. That'll be tomorrow at the earliest. This weather's not fit for travel, especially given your injuries. Ella felt a complex mixture of relief and frustration. Every day delayed was another day. Caldwell remained free to continue his operations, potentially destroying evidence or intimidating witnesses. Yet her body's limitations were undeniable. Even with Sarah's remarkable medicines, she was far from healed. Will your absence alert Caldwell? She asked, a new worry surfacing. Already handled, Robinson said with grim satisfaction. I sent a telegram to Salt Lake City before heading into these mountains requesting additional marshals to investigate mining claim, irregularities, standard procedure, nothing to raise particular alarm. Meanwhile, I've let it be known I'm pursuing reports of cattle rustlers near the Nevada border in the opposite direction from here. Hawks had moved to confer with his grandmother, their conversation too quiet for Ella to hear. After a moment, he rejoined the discussion. The storm will pass by morning, he said with the confidence of someone who had read weather patterns all his life. But the trails will be treacherous, mud-fallen trees possibly flash, floods in the narrow passes. You know these mountains better than anyone. Robinson acknowledged. What route would you recommend to reach my camp safely? The simple question, asked without hesitation or condescension, revealed much about the marshal's character. Unlike most white authority figures Ella had encountered, Robinson seemed to genuinely respect Hawks's knowledge and abilities. Hawks considered for a moment, then moved to the cave floor, where a thin layer of sand had accumulated near the entrance. Using a stick, he sketched a rough map indicating ridgelines, valleys, and watercourses. The direct route would take us across Devil's Backbone, he explained, tracing a narrow ridge. But after rain, it becomes extremely dangerous. Instead, we should follow this valley to Elk Creek, then take the Hunter's Trail up through Three Pines Pass. Robinson studied the map with focused attention. Longer but safer, he observed. How much additional time? Perhaps 3 hours. Hawks replied, but we arrive alive. A fair trade, Robinson agreed. He glanced at Ella. Can you manage the journey? It won't be easy terrain. Ella straightened her shoulders, refusing to be the weak link in their plans. I'll manage, she said firmly. I've come too far to falter now. Sarah approached, speaking directly to Ella despite the language barrier. Though the words were unintelligible, her intent was clear as she gestured toward Ella's splinted leg and the medicine simmering by the fire. My grandmother says you need 1 more night of her strongest healing medicines. Hawks translated. She will prepare treatments for the journey, but you must rest completely until morning. The old woman's tone brooked no argument, reminding Ella of her earlier comparison to her own family's matriarchs. She nodded agreement, earning an approving smile from Sarah, who immediately set about preparing various medicinal concoctions. As night deepened outside the cave, Ella found herself watching the interactions between her unlikely allies. Marshal Robinson cleaned and checked his weapons with methodical precision, occasionally exchanging observations with Hawks about trail conditions or Caldwell's men. Hawks moved between assisting his grandmother and securing their supplies for the journey ahead, his movements economical and purposeful. Sarah worked steadily at her medicines, occasionally humming what sounded like prayer songs under her breath. These 3 people, A federal lawman, an Apache hunter, and an elderly medicine woman had no reason to risk their lives for her. Yet here they were planning and preparing to ensure both her safety and the delivery of justice for Michael and the other victims of Caldwell's greed. Why? Ella asked, suddenly the question escaping before she could reconsider it. Why help me, all of you? You've risked everything for a stranger. Robinson looked up from his gun cleaning. Ma'am, I swore an oath to uphold the law and protect the innocent. That's not just words to me, it's my purpose. He reassembled his revolver with practiced hands. Too many turn a blind eye to men like Caldwell because confronting them is dangerous or inconvenient. I can't abide that. Hawk's response was more measured, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. My people have a saying, the mountain lion who devours one fawn will return for the entire herd. Three, Caldwell threatened my tribe killed your husband and would destroy anyone else standing between him and what he desires. He shrugged slightly. Sometimes fighting a predator is simply necessary. Sarah spoke last, her weathered hand gesturing toward Ella, then to herself, then encompassing the entire group with a circular motion. Though Ella couldn't understand the words, Hawks's translation captured their essence. My grandmother says that helping others is what makes us human. He explained, the coyote looks after himself alone. The human looks after the circle of life that sustains us all. Ella felt unexpected. Tears prick her eyes, not from pain or fear, but from the profound connection articulated in these simple explanations. Despite their different backgrounds, languages, and experiences, each person in this cave understood something fundamental about justice and compassion that Caldwell and his ilk would never comprehend. The storm intensified outside, rain drumming against the rocky slopes and wind moaning through the pines. Yet inside their shelter, a different kind of weather was brewing: determination, purpose, and the quiet strength of principled alliance against cruelty and corruption. Morning brought clearing skies and the practical challenges of preparing for their journey. Sarah examined Ella's injuries one final time, applying fresh poultices and wrapping her broken leg more securely for travel. The improvement over the past 3 days was remarkable. The knife wound had begun truly healing rather than merely scabbing over, and the broken leg, while still painful, could bear minimal weight when properly supported. Hawks fashioned a walking stick similar to the one Ella had used during their journey to the cave, but with improvements based on observing her movements, a more comfortable grip, better balance, and a slightly altered length to better accommodate her height and injured leg. Marshal Robinson reviewed their route once more, with Hawks committing key landmarks to memory, while discussing potential challenges and alternatives should they encounter obstacles. His thoroughness reminded Ella of Michael's approach to geological surveys, careful planning to minimize risk with contingencies for unexpected developments. The most difficult moment came when Sarah made it clear she would not be joining them. The old woman would remain in the cave, erasing all evidence of their presence before returning to the cabin by a different route. Despite Ella's concern for her safety, Hawks explained that his grandmother would be far more vulnerable traveling with them than making her own way home through paths known only to their people. Ella embraced the old woman before departing, trying to convey through that simple gesture the depth of her gratitude for the life-saving care she had received. Sarah responded by pressing a small leather pouch into Ella's hands medicines for the journey, accompanied by instructions translated by Hawks for their proper use. The morning air carried the fresh scent of rain-washed pine as they departed the cave. Water droplets sparkled on every surface, transforming the forest into a cathedral of green and gold as sunlight filtered through the canopy. Birds had resumed their songs after the storm's interruption, creating a backdrop of normality that seemed at odds with their dangerous mission. Hawks led the way, moving with the silent efficiency Ella had come to expect. Robinson walked beside Ella, occasionally offering a steadying hand when the terrain proved particularly challenging for her injured leg. The marshal maintained a vigilant watch on their surroundings, his hand never straying far from his holstered revolver. Their progress was necessarily slow but steady. Ella found that Sarah's final medicine treatment had provided significant pain relief without the disorienting effects of earlier doses. She could focus clearly on the path ahead while still managing the discomfort of her injuries. "You're remarkably resilient, Mrs. Chen," Robinson observed during a brief rest by a small stream. Ella sipped water from a canteen, considering his words. I've learned that survival often comes down to simple stubbornness. She replied, refusing to accept the ending. Someone else has written for your story. A philosophy I share, the marshal said with unexpected warmth, though I usually express it less eloquently. Their journey continued through increasingly rugged terrain. The storm had indeed left its mark on the landscape. Fallen branches littered the forest floor, and several times they were forced to detour around sections of trail washed away by minor landslides. By midday, they had climbed to a higher elevation that offered occasional views across the surrounding wilderness. During one such moment from a rocky outcropping that provided a natural viewpoint, Hawks suddenly raised his hand in the universal signal to stop and be silent. He pointed toward a distant valley where Ella could just make out tiny figures on horseback, perhaps 6 or 7 riders, moving in loose formation along a creek bed. Caldwell's men, Robinson asked quietly, producing a small spyglass from his coat pocket. Hawks nodded, accepting the offered spyglass for a closer look. Wallace and Jenkins among them. He confirmed, they search in an expanding pattern from where they last saw signs of our passage. Will they find the cave? Ella asked, anxiety tightening her chest. No, Hawks replied with certainty. The rain has erased all tracks, and my grandmother will remove any remaining evidence of our presence. They search blindly, now growing frustrated and careless. Robinson reclaimed his spyglass, studying the distant riders. They're heading away from our intended route, he observed, but we should remain cautious. How much farther to your camp, Marshal? Less than 3 miles as the crow flies, Robinson replied. Though the terrain makes it closer to 5 by trail, we should reach it by late afternoon if we maintain our current pace. They resumed their journey, Hawks now taking even greater care to leave minimal signs of their passage. He occasionally backtracked to brush away footprints or rearrange displaced stones. Subtle details most wouldn't notice, but which might catch the eye of an experienced tracker. The afternoon brought increasing cloud cover and cooler temperatures as they climbed higher into the mountains. Ella found her strength beginning to flag, the accumulated strain of her injuries and the challenging terrain taking their toll. She pressed on without complaint, aware that every step brought them closer to safety and justice. Finally, as the light began to fade toward evening, Hawks paused at the edge of a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. He made a bird call, 3 notes rising, 2 falling, similar to the signal Ella had heard when he returned to the cave. After a moment, an answering call came from within the stand of trees. Robinson nodded with satisfaction. My deputy, he explained. I left him to guard the camp and horses while I searched for you. They moved forward into the clearing, where a well-established camp appeared among the trees. A small tent had been erected. Horses were picketed nearby, and a fire pit showed signs of recent but careful use. A young man emerged from the tree-line, rifle ready until he recognized the marshal. Deputy Morgan Wells. Robinson introduced him. One of the few men in the territory I trust completely. Morgan, this is Mrs. Eleanor Chen and James Hawks of the Apache people. The deputy nodded respectfully to both. Camp secure, sir. No sign of Caldwell's men or anyone else since you left. His gaze lingered briefly on Ella's injuries. Ma'am, we've got a bedroll prepared in the tent if you'd like to rest. The simple courtesy nearly undid Ella's hard-won composure. After days of pain, fear, and desperate struggle, the prospect of safety, however temporary, threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained facade of strength. Hawks, perceptive as always, noticed her reaction. You have honored your ancestors with your courage, he said quietly. There is no weakness in resting now. Ella managed a grateful smile, allowing Deputy Wells to help her to the tent. Inside, she found a clean bedroll with extra blankets and even a small pillow. Luxuries beyond imagining just days ago, when she lay dying in an abandoned mine shaft. As she settled onto this simple but comfortable arrangement, Ella heard the men speaking outside, their voices low but clear enough to follow. How secure is this location? Hawks was asking. Defensible. Robinson replied, single approach, good visibility, plenty of cover if needed. We'll maintain watches through the night just in case. And tomorrow, won't we ride for Jackson's Crossing? The marshal explained. There's a telegraph office there, and I can arrange for an escort to the territorial capital once Mrs. Chen and her evidence are safely delivered to the federal judge. We can proceed with formal charges against Caldwell. He will not surrender easily, Hawks observed. Few men of his type do. Robinson agreed, but he's not above the law no matter how much he believes otherwise. Their voices faded as Ella's exhaustion claimed her, pulling her into the first truly restful sleep she had experienced since her ordeal began. Her last conscious thought was of Michael, how he would have appreciated the unlikely alliance that had formed to bring his killer to justice, and how he might finally rest easier once that justice was secured. The next morning brought renewed purpose and energy. Ella awakened to find her injuries less painful than expected, testament to both Sarah's remarkable medicines and her own body's determination to heal. With assistance from Deputy Wells, she emerged from the tent to find breakfast prepared and plans already underway for their departure. Marshal Robinson approached as she accepted a cup of coffee, strong and surprisingly good given their wilderness location. "We'll need to ride double," he explained. "I'd prefer you share a mount with Deputy Wells. He's our best horseman and his gelding is the steadiest of our animals." Ella nodded agreement. Though she had ridden extensively in her youth in San Francisco, her injuries made solo riding impractical at best and dangerous at worst. "What about Hawks?" she asked, noting the Apache man was preparing to depart, gathering his minimal gear. "He'll accompany us to the edge of settled lands," Robinson explained. "Beyond that, his presence might create more complications than assistance." His expression revealed his regret at this reality. "The territorial authorities aren't as enlightened about native allies as I might wish." Hawks approached his rifle, slung across his back, and his expression characteristically composed. "I will ensure no one follows your trail," he said, "and carry word to my grandmother of your safe passage." Ella extended her hand, the gesture somehow inadequate for all she owed this man. "I can never repay what you've done," she said simply. "Without you, I would have died in that mine." Hawks clasped her hand briefly. "Perhaps someday these mountains will know peace between our peoples," he replied. "That would be payment enough." He turned to Robinson. 3 miles beyond Jackson's Crossing, where Pine Creek joins the river, my cousin keeps a trading post. If you ever need to reach me, leave word there." The marshal nodded, understanding the significant trust implied in sharing such information. "I hope we meet again under better circumstances," he said, extending his own hand, which Hawks grasped firmly. Within the hour they were underway, Ella riding double with Deputy Wells as suggested, Marshal Robinson leading the small procession with their pack horse following behind. Hawks accompanied them for the first mile before melting into the forest with a final raised hand of farewell. As they descended toward more populated regions, Ella found herself thinking of the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment, from desperate widow seeking justice to trapped victim, facing death, to a woman now riding toward the fulfillment of her quest, supported by the law she had almost lost faith in. The evidence secured in her tin box represented more than just the means to punish Caldwell for Michael's murder. It symbolized the possibility of justice in a frontier often governed more by strength and cunning than by law and principle. It offered hope that even in these wild territories, civilization in its truest sense, the protection of the innocent and the restraint of the powerful, might eventually prevail. Jackson's Crossing appeared on the horizon by mid-afternoon, a small settlement consisting primarily of a general store livery stable and the telegraph office Robinson had mentioned. Civilization, with all its promises and compromises, awaited them. Ella straightened her posture as they approached, prepared to face whatever challenges still lay ahead. She had survived the darkness of the mineshaft, the pain of her injuries, and the pursuit of ruthless men. Whatever came next, she would meet it with the same determination that had carried her this far, honoring Michael's memory and her own discovered strength. Behind them, the mountains stood silent, witness to her journey, their peaks catching the afternoon sunlight like beacons pointing toward a justice too long delayed but now at last within reach. However, as they neared the outskirts of the settlement, Deputy Wells suddenly reined in his horse. "Marshal," he called in a low, urgent voice, "something's not right." Robinson pulled up beside them, his experienced eyes scanning the town ahead. What do you see? Too many horses at the livery. Wells replied, and that's Sheriff Wallace's bay tied outside the telegraph office. Ella's heart sank. The reprieve had been too good to last. Somehow Caldwell had anticipated their route and set a trap. Caldwell must have men watching all the approaches to civilization, Robinson muttered. Any place we might seek help or send word to the authorities. What do we do now? Ella asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Robinson considered their options, his weathered face grim. We can't risk Jackson's crossing, not with Wallace there, and likely more of Caldwell's men. We'll have to bypass it, head directly for Silver Springs. It's another day's hard ride, but there's a larger marshal's office there. Nor as they turned to retreat back into the shelter of the forest, a rifle shot cracked through the air. Deputy Wells jerked in the saddle, crying out as a bullet tore through his shoulder. Ambush! Robinson shouted, drawing his revolver. Into the trees now. Ella clung to the reins as Wells, despite his wound, kicked their horse into a gallop. More shots followed, bullets whining past their heads as they rode hard for the tree line. Behind them, men shouted and hoofbeats thundered as their pursuers gave chase. They plunged into the forest branches, whipping at their faces. Wells was bleeding heavily, his strength clearly fading. Keep going, he gasped to Ella. Don't let them take you. Robinson rode close beside them, firing back periodically to slow their pursuers. There's an old mining camp 2 miles east. He called, we can make a stand there if necessary. Ella could hear Wells's breathing becoming more labored. The deputy was struggling to stay conscious, and she wasn't sure how much longer he could remain in the saddle. She wrapped one arm around his waist, trying to support him, while steering the panicked horse with her other hand. The sound of pursuit grew louder behind them. They weren't going to outrun Caldwell's men, not with Wells injured and Ella still recovering from her own wounds. They needed another option. As they crashed through a small clearing, a familiar figure suddenly appeared on horseback directly in their path. Hawks sat astride Spirit rifle, ready, his face set in lines of grim determination. This way, he called immediately, wheeling his mount. Quickly! Without hesitation, Robinson signaled for them to follow, trusting the Apache tracker's knowledge of the terrain. Hawks led them down a nearly invisible game trail that angled sharply into a rocky ravine. The path was treacherous, loose stones and tight turns that slowed their pursuers, who were unfamiliar with the dangerous terrain. After several nerve-wracking minutes of difficult riding, they emerged at the base of a steep cliff face. To Ella's surprise, Hawks motioned them directly toward what appeared to be solid rock. Only as they drew closer did she perceive the narrow opening, a crevice just wide enough for a horse to pass through sideways. Dismount, Hawks. Hawks ordered. The horses must be led through. It opens to a hidden valley beyond. Robinson helped Wells from the saddle, the deputy now barely conscious from blood loss. Ella slid down awkwardly her splinted leg, protesting the sudden weight. Together they managed to lead the frightened horses through the narrow passage, emerging into a small sheltered canyon, invisible from the surrounding terrain. My people have used this place for generations, Hawks explained as he helped position Wells against a boulder. A sanctuary when we were hunted. None of Caldwell's men know of it. He immediately turned his attention to the wounded deputy, cutting away the blood-soaked shirt to examine the injury. The bullet passed through, he reported, but he has lost much blood. Can you help him? Robinson asked, his concern evident. Hawks nodded grimly. I know some of my grandmother's ways. Enough perhaps to save him if the wound doesn't become infected? As Hawks set about treating Wells, Robinson pulled Ella aside. This changes everything, he said in a low voice. We can't reach Silver Springs with a wounded man, and Caldwell's men are clearly watching all the approaches to civilization. What are our options? Ella asked, though she already suspected the answer. Limited, Robinson admitted. We can't stay here indefinitely. Eventually they'll widen their search. Maybe bring in trackers of their own. He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. We need to get your evidence to the federal authorities, but Caldwell has cut off our routes. Ella considered the problem, her analytical mind searching for alternatives. What if we split up? She suggested finally. I could continue with the evidence while you and Hawks care for Deputy Wells. Robinson shook his head firmly. Caldwell wants you dead more than anyone. I won't leave you unprotected. Then you take the evidence, she countered. I'll stay here with Hawks and the deputy. Your chances of slipping through their net are better alone. The marshal was silent for a long moment, weighing their limited options. It's a risk, he finally acknowledged. But perhaps our best hope. Before they could discuss it further, Hawks rejoined them. I've done what I can for Wells, he reported, but he needs better care than I can provide. And soon, Ella outlined her suggestion to the Apache tracker. Hawks listened intently, his dark eyes unreadable. When she finished, he nodded slowly. It could work, he agreed, but not as you have proposed. He turned to Robinson. You must stay with your deputy. He is your responsibility, and he will die without proper care. I will guide Mrs. Chen through paths Caldwell's men cannot follow. Where would you take her? Robinson asked. There is another way into Silver Springs, difficult, dangerous, but unknown to white men, through the high country where few dare to travel. With my guidance, we could reach it in 2 days. Ella felt a surge of hope. I'm willing to try, she said firmly. This may be our only chance to bring Caldwell to justice. Robinson hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to his injured deputy and his mission to deliver Ella's evidence safely. Finally, he nodded, his decision made. Very well. Hawks, I'm placing Mrs. Chen's safety in your hands. His voice hardened. Get her to Silver Springs, whatever it takes. I'll do what I can for Wells, then make my own way there as soon as possible. As dust settled over the hidden canyon, they prepared for their separate journeys. Robinson provided Hawks with additional ammunition and supplies from their packs. Ella checked her precious tin box one final time, securing it inside the leather pouch Hawks had fashioned for her to wear beneath her clothing. Be careful, Robinson urged as they prepared to depart. Caldwell will only intensify his search when he realizes we've slipped his net. Ella nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. We will, and you do the same. Take care of Deputy Wells. With final farewells exchanged, Hawks helped Ella mount Spirit. Instead of riding double, he chose to lead the horse on foot, explaining that the trail ahead would be too treacherous for the animal to carry both of them safely. As they departed through a narrow exit at the far end of the canyon, Ella looked back at Robinson, tending to his wounded deputy. The unlikely alliance that had given her hope was now divided, their futures uncertain. She could only trust that the determination that had brought them this far would see them safely to the end of their journey. Hawks led them steadily upward, following game trails so faint Ella would never have noticed them without his guidance. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, providing just enough light for them to continue their ascent into the high country. We must travel through the night, Hawks explained softly. Distance is our only safety now. Ella nodded, settling herself for the long journey ahead. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty, she felt a strange sense of calm. Perhaps it was the mountain air, clean and pure, washing away the fear and doubt. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that whether they succeeded or failed, she had done everything in her power to bring Michael's killers to justice. The moon rose, painting the rugged landscape in silver as they climbed ever higher into the mountains, leaving the world of men behind for the realm of eagles and stars. By dawn, they had reached a high alpine meadow surrounded by towering peaks. Hawks called a brief halt, allowing Ella and Spirit to rest, while he scanned their back trail for any sign of pursuit. Finding none, he permitted a cold camp. No fire that might be spotted, but some dried meat and water to restore their strength. How much farther? Ella asked, easing her splinted leg into a more comfortable position. 2 days to Silver Springs if all goes well, Hawks replied, his eyes constantly moving across the landscape. But first we must cross Thunder Pass. He pointed to a narrow saddle between two massive peaks ahead. Few attempt it. The storms there are fierce and unpredictable. But it is our quickest route, and Caldwell's men will never follow. They rested for an hour, then continued their journey. The terrain grew increasingly challenging, loose scree slopes that threatened to give way underfoot, narrow ledges overlooking dizzying drops. Dense stands of stunted pines that clawed at their clothing. Through it all, Hawks moved with quiet confidence, finding passages Ella would never have discovered alone. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the approach to Thunder Pass. Dark clouds were already gathering above the peaks, confirming Hawk's warning about the area's volatile weather. "We must hurry," he said, eyeing the building storm. "Once it breaks, the pass becomes impassable." Ella steeled herself for the final climb, ignoring the constant throbbing in her leg and the exhaustion that pulled at her limbs. Together they urged Spirit up the increasingly steep trail, the sure-footed horse picking his way carefully among the loose rocks. The wind rose as they neared the top of the pass, bringing with it the first cold drops of rain. Hawks glanced anxiously at the blackening sky, clearly worried about their timing. They were still a quarter-mile from the pass's highest point when lightning split. The heavens followed immediately by a deafening crash of thunder. "Run!" Hawks shouted above the rising wind. "We must reach the other side before the full storm hits." They abandoned caution, pushing forward as quickly as possible. Spirit snorted fearfully as more lightning flashed around them, but the loyal animal continued to follow Hawks's lead. The trail narrowed to barely the width of the horse, with a sheer drop on one side and a towering rock face on the other. Rain began to fall in earnest, quickly turning to stinging pellets of hail. The path grew slick underfoot, each step a potential disaster. Ella clung to Spirit's mane, her heart pounding with the effort and fear. Finally, they crested the pass, a knife-edge ridge buffeted by howling winds. Ahead, Ella could just make out the beginning of the descent on the far side, their route to safety. But as they started across the exposed ridgeline, disaster struck. A massive lightning bolt slammed into the peak above them, dislodging a cascade of rocks and debris. Hawks shouted a warning, pulling Spirit back just as the slide thundered down, cutting off their path forward. "Back!" he yelled over the storm's fury. "We must find another way." They retreated from the ridgeline, seeking shelter beneath an overhanging rock as the storm reached its full fury around them. Pinned down and with their route blocked, they could only wait for the tempest to pass. Huddled beneath the meager shelter, Ella felt a creeping despair. They were losing precious time, and Caldwell's men would be spreading their net wider with each passing hour. The thunder seemed to mock their efforts, echoing between the peaks like the laughter of cruel gods. Hawk sat beside her, his face a stoic mask that nevertheless failed to completely hide his concern. "The storm will pass," he said, though whether to reassure her or himself wasn't clear. "And then," Ella asked, wringing water from her sodden skirt. "Then we find another way," he replied with simple determination. "There is always another path for those willing to look." As they waited, Ella's thoughts turned to the document hidden safely against her skin, the evidence that could bring down a powerful, ruthless man. So much sacrifice, so much pain, all for a few sheets of paper that might, if they were very fortunate, bring a measure of justice to a lawless frontier. "Was it worth it?" she asked, suddenly, the question escaping before she could consider it. All of this for a chance at justice that might never come. Hawk studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "My grandfather once told me that a tree does not grow in a day, nor does it reach for the sky all at once. It grows slowly, ring by ring, year after year. Justice is like this tree. Each small act, each time someone stands against evil, adds another ring. The tree may not be complete in our lifetime, but still we must add our rings." Ella considered his words, finding unexpected comfort in their simple wisdom. Whether or not they succeeded in bringing Caldwell to justice, they had refused to surrender to his evil, that in itself was a victory of sorts. The storm raged for hours, trapping them in their precarious shelter as darkness fell once more. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both, and they dozed fitfully, taking turns to watch over their small haven against the elements. Ella woke to Hawks gently shaking her shoulder. "The storm has passed," he said, "and I have found another way." Outside their shelter, a transformed world awaited. The storm had washed the landscape clean, leaving a crystalline clarity to the air. Stars still dotted the pre-dawn sky, but the eastern horizon showed the first faint blush of approaching daylight. "Our original route is blocked," Hawks explained, pointing to the massive rock slide that had cut off Thunder Pass. "But there is an older trail, steeper, more difficult, but passable." My people used it in the time of my grandfather's grandfather. How did you find it in the dark? Ella asked, impressed. A ghost of a smile crossed Hawk's face. The mountain showed me. Sometimes when all human paths are blocked, nature opens a door. They set off immediately, Hawk's leading Spirit with Ella mounted once more. The older trail proved to be little more than a game path in places so steep and narrow that Ella frequently had to dismount and cling to the rock face, while Hawks led Spirit separately across particularly treacherous sections. By midday, they had successfully crossed the mountain barrier, descending into a hidden valley on the far side. Hawks allowed them a longer rest here, confident that no pursuit could have followed their difficult route. We have gained an advantage, he said as they shared the last of their dried meat. From here we can reach Silver Springs by tomorrow evening if we push hard. Ella nodded, renewed determination filling her. They were close now, so close to bringing Michael's killers to justice. Just a day and a half more, and her evidence would be safely in the hands of federal authorities. As they prepared to continue their journey, Hawks suddenly went still, his head cocked in a listening posture that Ella had come to recognize. She froze, straining her own ears, but hearing nothing unusual, just the wind in the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. "What is it?" she whispered. "Horses," Hawks replied quietly. "Many horses moving quickly, coming this way." Ella's heart sank. "Wakilam, Caldwell's men. But how could they have found us?" Hawks moved silently to a nearby ridge, lying flat to study the approaching riders without being seen. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Not Caldwell's men," he reported. "Worse renegades, mixed band of outcast deserters and broken men who prey on travelers. They must have spotted our movement from another peak." "What do we do?" Ella asked, fear tightening her throat. "We run," Hawks said simply, "and hope they do not catch us." They mounted up immediately, Hawks swinging onto Spirit's back behind Ella. The powerful horse would move faster, carrying both of them, than with Hawks leading on foot. They set off at the fastest pace they dared, on the rough terrain heading east toward Silver Springs. For hours they pushed forward, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the laboring horse. Hawks kept them to forested areas whenever possible, using the cover to hide their passage. But the renegade band was persistent, and by late afternoon it was clear they were gaining ground. "They have fresher horses," Hawks said as they paused briefly at a stream crossing. "And they know these mountains almost as well as I do." "What happens if they catch us?" Ella asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Hawks checked his rifle, his face set in grim lines. "Nothing good," he said finally. "These men have abandoned all tribal and settler laws. They take what they want and kill without remorse." They pushed on, but Spirit was tiring, and the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. As dusk approached, Hawks made a difficult decision. "There is a narrow canyon ahead," he explained, "with high walls and only one entrance. Defensible, but also a trap if overrun. It may be our only chance." "Then we take it," Ella said firmly. They reached the canyon just as the last light was fading from the sky. As Hawks had described, it was protected by steep walls on three sides with a single entrance that could be defended. A small stream ran through it, providing water, and there was enough grass for Spirit to graze. "Help me build some defenses." Hawks directed already gathering fallen logs to create a rough barricade near the canyon mouth. Together they worked quickly in the gathering darkness, preparing for the coming fight. Hawks positioned Ella behind the heaviest cover, showing her how to reload his spare rifle if necessary. "If they overwhelm our position," he said quietly, "do not let them take you alive. Your evidence dies with you rather than falling into their hands." Ella nodded, understanding the grim reality of their situation. "And you?" Hawks checked his weapons one final time. "I will ensure they pay dearly for their victory." They didn't have long to wait. Within an hour, the sounds of approaching horsemen echoed from the surrounding forest. Hawks signaled for absolute silence, both of them crouching behind their makeshift barricade as the renegade band drew near. In the pale moonlight, Ella could make out perhaps a dozen riders, a ragged, dangerous-looking collection of men from various backgrounds united only by the predatory purpose in their movements. They approach the canyon carefully, clearly suspecting a trap. They'll rush us once they confirm our position, Hawks whispered. I'll hold them as long as possible. If I fall, use this. He pressed a small derringer into her hand, a last resort weapon she hadn't known he possessed. Ella accepted it silently, praying it wouldn't come to that. She clutched her tin box of evidence now secured inside her bodice, the precious documents that had cost so much blood and suffering to protect. The renegades had halted just beyond effective rifle range, conferring among themselves. Suddenly, a rough voice called out from the darkness. We know you're in there, Apache. Send out the woman and whatever valuables you're carrying, and we might let you live. Hawks made no reply, but shifted his rifle sighting carefully on the speaker. Last chance, the voice called again. Or we come in and take what we want, and it'll go harder on the woman. The threat hung in the air for a moment before Hawk's rifle cracked the sound echoing off the canyon walls. A scream of pain followed, and the renegades scattered for cover. First blood to us, Hawks murmured grimly. Now they know our position is defensible. What followed was a nightmarish game of cat and mouse. The renegades probed their defenses repeatedly, firing blindly into the canyon, then retreating when Hawks returned fire with deadly accuracy. Twice they attempted more coordinated rushes, only to fall back with casualties. As midnight approached, a tense stalemate had developed. Hawks had dropped at least 3 attackers, but the others maintained their siege, waiting for fatigue or dwindling ammunition to weaken the defenders. How much longer can we hold? Ella whispered during a lull in the fighting. Until dawn, perhaps, Hawks replied honestly. They will try again before first light, their best chance to overwhelm us. Ella nodded, accepting their precarious situation. I'm sorry I brought this danger to you, she said softly. Hawks shook his head. You did not bring it. Men like Caldwell and these renegades, they are the ones who bring darkness to these mountains. He checked his ammunition with practiced hands. If we die tonight, we die fighting for something worth the cost. As they waited for the next assault, a strange sound caught Ella's attention, a distant rumbling that seemed to grow steadily louder. At first she thought it might be thunder, but the sky remained clear and star-filled. Hawks tensed beside her, listening intently. Riders? He said, his voice tight with concentration. Many riders coming fast. More renegades? Ella asked, heart sinking. No, Hawks' expression showed rare uncertainty. Too organized, too disciplined in their formation. The renegades besieging them had heard it too. Their movements became agitated, confused shouts carrying to the canyon as they tried to determine this new threat. The rumbling grew to a thunder of hoofbeats, and suddenly the night erupted with gunfire, not directed at Ella and Hawks, but at the renegade band. Shouts and screams filled the air as the newcomers fell upon the besiegers with overwhelming force. Stay down, Hawks warned, keeping his rifle ready, until we know who they are. The fighting was brief but intense. Within minutes, the renegades were scattered or captured their attempt to flee, hindered by the darkness and unfamiliar terrain. As silence fell once more, a voice called out from beyond their barricade. James Hawks, Mrs. Chen, are you in there? Ella's heart leaped at the familiar voice. Marshal Robinson, hold your fire, Hawks called back. We're coming out. They emerged cautiously from their defensive position to find Robinson at the head of a dozen mounted men wearing marshal's badges. The lawman dismounted, relief evident on his weathered face. Thank God you're both alive, he said. We've been tracking you since yesterday. How did you find us? Ella asked, still barely believing their sudden reversal of fortune. Robinson gestured to a figure at the edge of the group, a slight elderly woman sitting astride a pony with remarkable dignity. Sarah Whisperwind nodded to her grandson, satisfaction evident in her bearing. My grandmother found you, Hawks said, understanding. Dawning, she tracked us through the mountains and led us straight to you, Robinson confirmed. After I got Wells to a doctor in Pine Ridge, I returned to find Sarah waiting for me. She insisted on guiding us personally, said she knew you were in danger. Ella moved to the elderly woman, reaching up to clasp her hand in gratitude. No words were needed between them. The bond forged in the cabin and cave transcended their language barrier. What about Caldwell? Hawks asked, turning back to Robinson. The marshal's expression hardened. That's why we pushed so hard to find you. Caldwell somehow learned we were gathering evidence against him. He's liquidating his assets and preparing to flee the territory. We have hours at most before he disappears. Shall we career? Then we need to move quickly. Ella said, her voice firm with renewed determination. How far are we from Silver Springs? About 4 hours hard ride, Robinson replied. My men can get us there by dawn if we leave now. Hawks helped Ella mount behind one of the deputies while Robinson outlined their plan. I've sent telegrams to every major settlement in the territory. Caldwell's description has been distributed to all law officers, but he has friends in high places and enough money to buy new identities. Our best chance is to catch him before he slips away. As they rode through the night, Ella clutched her precious evidence, exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the face of this final challenge. They were so close now. Justice for Michael, for Hawks's people, for all of Caldwell's victims was within their grasp if they could just reach Silver Springs in time. The eastern sky was lightening toward dawn when they finally crested a ridge overlooking Silver Springs, a substantial settlement with a proper courthouse, hotels, and businesses lining its main street. Smoke rose from morning fires and early risers were already moving about their business. Caldwell will be at the Silver Palace Hotel, Robinson said as they descended toward the town. It's the only establishment luxury enough for his tastes. I've had men watching it since yesterday. We could soon. They rode directly to the federal marshal's office, a solid brick building near the courthouse. Inside, they found organized activity already underway. Maps were spread across tables, and deputies moved with purpose, preparing for what was clearly a significant operation. Robinson immediately conferred with the chief marshal, a gray-haired veteran named Bradford, while Ella gratefully accepted a chair and a cup of hot coffee. Hawks remained near the door, uncomfortable in the confined space of the government building, but unwilling to leave Ella's side until her safety was assured. After a brief conference, Robinson returned to them. Caldwell is indeed at the Silver Palace, but he's checking out this morning. He has a private rail car waiting at the station, scheduled to depart at noon. His expression was grim. Once he's on that train, he could be halfway to Mexico before we can organize an effective pursuit. Now, then we must arrest him now. Ella insisted, reaching for her tin box of evidence. Robinson nodded. Chief Bradford is preparing the paperwork for a federal warrant based on your evidence. We'll move as soon as it's signed within the hour. Ella handed over her precious documents, watching anxiously as Bradford and his clerk began the formal process of preparing charges. After so long fighting alone, it was strange to see Michael's murder reduced to legal terminology. His killer's fate determined by stamps and signatures on official forms. Robinson sensed her disquiet. I know it seems cold, he said quietly. All this procedure when what you want is justice. But this is how we ensure Caldwell can't escape through legal maneuvering. We're building a cage he can't break paper by paper. Ella nodded, understanding the necessity, but still feeling the emotional distance between her personal quest and the machinery of law now taking over. What happens when you arrest him? He'll be held for trial. Robinson explained. You'll need to testify, of course, with your evidence and testimony, along with what we've gathered from other territories. He'll almost certainly hang. Hawks, who had been listening silently, spoke up. Caldwell will not surrender easily. He is a cornered predator now, most dangerous when trapped. Robinson acknowledged this with a grim nod. We're preparing for resistance. Bradford has assembled 20 deputies for the arrest, overwhelming force to minimize bloodshed. An hour later, the warrant was complete. Bradford gathered his men in the street outside, issuing final instructions. Before they moved on the hotel, Ella watched from the marshal's office window, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Robinson approached, buckling on his gun belt. You should remain here, he advised. It's safer, and there's no need for you to witness the arrest. Ella shook her head firmly. I've come too far to stop now. I need to see this through to the end. After a moment's hesitation, Robinson nodded his understanding. Stay behind the deputies at all times. If there's trouble, find cover immediately. With Hawks at her side, Ella joined the procession, moving toward the Silver Palace Hotel. Early morning shoppers and businessmen paused to stare at the grim-faced lawmen marching purposefully down the main street. Word spread quickly and curious onlookers began to gather, sensing something momentous was about to occur. The Silver Palace lived up to its name, a three-story structure of imposing grandeur with ornate balconies and gilded trim that seemed out of place in the frontier town. As they approached, Bradford deployed his men strategically covering all exits before Robinson and four senior deputies ascended the broad front steps. Ella and Hawks remained at the edge of the square opposite the hotel, watching as Bradford entered the opulent lobby. Through the large front windows, she could see the marshal speaking with a flustered desk clerk who pointed toward the grand staircase leading to the upper floors. Time seemed to stretch, each moment extending into infinity, as Ella waited for the confrontation that would conclude her long quest for justice. Around her, the crowd continued to grow, whispers and speculation running through the gathered townspeople. Suddenly, a commotion erupted inside the hotel. Shouts echoed from the upper floors, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Ella's heart leaped into her throat as more shots rang out, accompanied by the crash of breaking glass. "Suikern, stay here," Hawks ordered, moving to position himself protectively in front of her. The lobby doors burst open and a man staggered out onto the hotel steps. Victor Caldwell, impeccably dressed, despite the early hour, blood staining one sleeve where a bullet had grazed him. In his hand gleamed a silver-plated revolver, which he fired blindly behind him as he fled. Deputies converged from every direction, shouting for him to surrender. Caldwell spun wildly, firing again, dropping one lawman with a lucky shot before sprinting toward a side alley. Ella watched in horror as the man who had murdered Michael, who had ordered her own death, who had brought so much suffering to the mountains, attempted to escape justice once more. Without conscious thought, she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Underwell!" He froze at the sound of her voice, turning slowly to face her across the square. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by disbelief and then pure hatred. "You," he snarled, "you should be dead and buried." "Like my husband," Ella replied, her voice steady, despite the thunder of her heartbeat. "Like all the others you've murdered for profit." For a moment they stared at each other, predator and prey roles now uncertain as justice closed in. Then with a roar of rage, Caldwell raised his revolver and fired directly at her. Hawks moved with lightning speed, shoving Ella aside as the bullet whined past. In the same fluid motion, he drew and fired his own weapon. His shot struck true, catching Caldwell high in the chest and spinning him halfway around. The mining magnate staggered, a look of utter surprise on his face. He tried to raise his gun again, but his strength was failing. More shots rang out as deputies fired and Caldwell collapsed onto the dusty street, his life's blood pooling beneath him. Ella moved forward in a daze. Hawks at her side as marshals surrounded the fallen man. Caldwell was still alive, but barely, his breathing ragged as he clutched at his ruined chest. His eyes found Ella's as she stood over him, hatred giving way to something like fear as he faced his mortality. "Was it worth it?" Ella asked softly, echoing the question she had asked Hawks during the storm. "All the lives you destroyed, all for gold and silver that you can't take with you now." Caldwell tried to speak, blood bubbling at his lips, but whatever final words or curses he intended were lost as death claimed him. His eyes fixed on something distant, seeing perhaps the judgment that awaited beyond this world. Robinson gently led Ella away as deputies covered the body. "It's over," he said quietly. "He can't hurt anyone else now." Ella looked back once at the man who had caused so much suffering, who had taken Michael from her, who had almost taken her own life. She had imagined this moment for so long, dreamed of seeing Caldwell face justice. The reality was both more and less than she had envisioned. Not the formal justice of a courtroom and gallows, but a reckoning nonetheless. "Yes," she said finally, "it's over." In the days that followed, the full extent of Caldwell's crimes came to light. His papers seized from his hotel room revealed a vast network of corruption that had strangled the territory for years. Officials were arrested, stolen properties returned to rightful owners, and compensation arranged for families of his victims where possible. For Ella, the aftermath brought an unexpected peace. Michael's body was finally recovered from the abandoned mine where Caldwell had dumped it, allowing her to give her husband a proper burial. The territorial governor personally attended the service publicly, acknowledging the debt owed to Michael Chen and his widow for bringing Caldwell's crimes to justice. A week after the shooting, Ella sat on the porch of the boarding house where she had taken temporary lodging in Silver Springs. The evening was mild, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She was considering her future, perhaps returning to San Francisco, perhaps remaining in the territory where Michael's memory seemed closer somehow. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. A familiar paint horse approached its rider, dismounting with fluid grace. James Hawks had changed his buckskins for a more conventional shirt and trousers, though his long hair remained uncut, a proud statement of his heritage. "I thought you had returned to your people," Ella said as he climbed the steps to join her. "Soon," Hawks replied, settling into the chair beside her. "My grandmother sends her blessings. She says your spirit has found balance again." Ella smiled, thinking of the remarkable old woman who had saved her life. "Please thank her for me for everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching as the town settled into evening routines. Lamps being lit, families gathering for dinner, the distant piano from the saloon playing a gentle tune. "What will you do now?" Hawks asked. Finally, Ella considered the question. "I'm not sure Marshal Robinson has offered me a position as a clerk in the federal office. Says my organizational skills and attention to detail would be valuable." She smiled slightly. "Apparently my evidence files against Caldwell were most impressively thorough." Hawks nodded approvingly. "You would bring order to their chaos, a worthy purpose." "And you," Ella asked, "will you return to your cabin in the mountains?" "For a time," Hawks replied. "But there are changes coming. Robinson has recommended me as a scout for the federal marshals to help bridge understanding between my people and the law." His expression revealed mixed feelings about the opportunity. It would mean traveling between two worlds belonging fully to neither. Like living on a mountain pass. Ella observed, difficult, exposed to storms from both sides, but also able to see farther than those in the valleys below. A rare smile crossed Hawk's face. "You have learned to speak in Apache wisdom, it seems." Ella laughed softly. "I had a good teacher. Several, in fact." Panana, as darkness settled fully over Silver Springs, they continued their quiet conversation. Two people from vastly different worlds who had found common ground in their pursuit of justice. The future remained uncertain. The territory was still wild, still struggling to balance freedom with law, still haunted by the ghosts of broken promises and violence. But tonight, in this moment of hard-won peace, Ella felt something she had not experienced since before Michael's death. Hope, not the desperate hope that had sustained her through her darkest hours in the mine, but something steadier and more enduring. A belief that even in this harsh land, good people could stand against evil, and sometimes against all odds prevail. Above them, stars blazed in the clear mountain sky, eternal witnesses to the struggles of the small figures moving beneath their light. Somewhere in that vast expanse, Ella liked to think Michael was watching too. His quest for justice finally fulfilled his memory, honored his killer, brought to account. It wasn't a perfect ending. Justice rarely was in these imperfect times, but it was enough. It had to be enough. In the mountains that had nearly claimed her life, Ella Chen had found not just survival, but purpose. Not just vengeance, but justice. Not just allies, but friends who had become something like family. And in the end, that was the richest silver vein of all.